Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? The debate that won't go away. Was it a lab leak? Did it come from a wet market? Will we ever truly know? The CIA now comes down on the side of the lab leak. The president is on the verge of putting the brakes on federal funding for what he is calling risky virus research. Senator Rand Paul is firing off a load of subpoenas to more than a dozen government agencies into research that he says may have caused the pandemic. And all of this as President Biden's preemptive pardon of Anthony Fauci only fuels suspicions. How did we get here? How did a scientific question, where did COVID come from, fuel an utter and complete collapse in trust? We'll ask two people who know a lot about the COVID origin story. One of them, a science writer who's been critical of how mainstream science has handled this issue. And the other, a scientist, one of the world's leading virologists who found himself at the center of this storm. We'll tell you why. Let's get started. Welcome. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
Maggie Bartlett.
I'm Mark Abdumalik.
Maggie, you nailed that. No pause.
I'm getting
this time.
so much faster.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Tom, who are we?
For the people listening, Brenda and I are journalists, Maggie virologist, Mark doctor.
Guys, joining us is the New York Times columnist, David Wallace-Wells.
Yeah,
Hi,
guys.
Welcome,
Welcome.
David.
In real life.
In real life, in the flesh. I know
One
he's in
room.
person. We're not even remote.
This couldn't be 2020.
Although,
we got here.
We've
speaking
come
of
so
which,
far. Yeah.
David is a science writer and a columnist. His blurb on the Times website says he explores climate change, technology, the future of the planet, and how we live on it. That means for the past several years, he has thought, edited, and written a ton about our long national nightmare of COVID. One of the reasons I really love chatting with David is because no matter what his politics are on something, he lets facts and the research drive him to sometimes politically inconvenient conclusions. And so with him, you never quite know where he's going to land on something, and I really do appreciate that. So Maggie, first of all, we say lab leak, wet market. What are we even talking about when we say that?
Great question. So lab leak refers to a virus coming either intentionally or unintentionally out of a lab environment into the public. While wet market refers to the virus coming from a natural origin. Now, there are some comments out there that it could be from a lab to the market, and we'll get into all of those nuances. But natural origin would be what I would consider like the most likely of scenarios and the one that historically has the most context.
And the wet market often refers to this idea that the virus was transmitted from an animal to a human, possibly originating at the Wuhan seafood market.
Right. So viruses exist all around us.
Okay, so No, I get it. And Tom, look, we are now 5 years. Holy shit, we are 5 years out.
Mm-hmm.
That is just crazy. Why are we talking about this week?
So 5 years later, I think it's a lot. This story is getting, I think, fueled up by the transition at the presidential level. Biden's leaving office. I think his last thing he does is issue a preemptive pardon for Anthony Fauci. He dates the pardon back to 2014, which, raises a lot of eyebrows. That's the year the U.S. put a pause on gain of function research, which we'll kind of define that term in a little bit. But that sort of kind of refuels this conspiracy theory, or if you look at it that way, or these accusations that the U.S. was funding this kind of dangerous, risky research in a Wuhan lab. You've got reports of Trump getting ready to issue an executive order right now, banning kind of risky research like this on viruses. And then the big headline was the CIA comes out with an assessment. The director says we're coming off the sidelines on this issue. And we believe, with low confidence, but we believe that this was a lab leak, and that was the cause of this virus. So,
just with no new evidence.
Yeah,
David, I think what we're trying to figure out is that discussion happened pretty quickly at the origins. I mean, it wasn't very long before people started to really throw this lightning rod of a question out.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the since FOIA'd emails between the authors of the Proximal Origins paper, which was this big paper that was published, I think, in February 2020.
And we're going to speak with one of the authors.
and that was sort of like the first signal from the quote unquote scientific establishment that there was an answer to this question and that it was almost certainly a natural origin. If you look at the FOIA emails of those researchers and their Slack conversations from before their initial meetings, a lot of them had big questions about what was possible. Some of them suspected that it might have been a lab leak. Others more equivocal, but all of those people who a few weeks later would sign on to a pretty emphatic dismissal of the theory of lab leak had at least initial, not just open-mindedness, but sort of genuine concern about what might have happened. So very early on at that level in the scientific community, there was a little bit of like a what's going on here set of questions. Then what followed was a period of time in which, along with everything else, the public was freaking out about the virus itself, watching case counts and death counts and hospitalizations and trying to manage all the varying bits of guidance from public health officials. Are we not masking? Are we masking? Is it safe to be outside? Is it not? Is this aerosol? Is it, whatever? All those things that we were walking through in the spring of 2020. And we basically deferred to the judgment of the most esteemed public health figures for a time. And, the media, TV news, newspapers, and to some extent, social media basically accepted the verdict from that paper and said, we may not know for sure, but like we're going to just treat this as basically a settled hypothesis for the time being. But all the while, there was a lot of circulating, questions outside those realms. And, the polls from mid-2020 show, it's not like 1% of Americans thought there was a lab leak. It's not like 5% of Americans thought there was a lab leak. It was something like a third, maybe 40%. So even in this period of time when there was, sort of, I think suppressed is too strong a word, but there was like, minimized public discussion of the issue, there was still a pretty large plurality or minority of Americans who had these really big questions about what had happened. And, ultimately we are not in all that more informed a place now to answer the question than we were then.
No. And how could we? I mean, I think about SARS 2003. It was 2013 before we knew what the animal reservoir was and could trace that back. That's 10 years later. And we're in such a different information ecosystem now. And I think people were understandably scared. And so they wanted an answer. It's a cleaner answer to say it came from this place and we know how to stop this than it is to say viruses.
I think that the SARS story is even more optimistic because I don't think because of the way that China responded to the initial outbreak here, I think we're not going to be able to really get the answer that we got then. I think we're kind of going to be left with the data that we have now, which is, I would say, inconclusive in both directions, but other people feel differently. But,
I would say if this were a murder mystery, the data would strongly support a natural origin in which two different lineages of the virus can be traced back to the Wuhan market that were circulating between bats and raccoon dogs that were introduced to two separate individuals and then spurred this outbreak. And I think those genetic data point very strongly in that direction, whereas all the data that has been looked at for the lab just is I feel like a lot of times it's unfair because they did look at, I know the conspiracy theories of like the people at Wuhan Institute of Virology, people were sick, but they didn't seroconvert. They did not have this virus. They didn't have anything like this virus in their freezers. And
I just think it's kind of crazy that we're in this moment where this conversation against among people that we have been speaking to, sort of regular Americans who think about the origins of COVID, in a way that like, I don't know that the origins of SARS and MERS and swine flu and all this stuff was as much of a lightning rod. So David, kind of like, how did we get to a point where this became so political, but also not just political, but it's now resulting in, I would say, one of the main drivers of mistrust for science right now?
Well, I think, to the first part of your question, one reason that we are so much more focused on the origin of this disease was that it was a much more consequential disease globally than those other ones. I mean, we're talking about 20 to 30 million people dying globally, 1.5 million Americans dying.
Very true. Yep.
Basically everyone on the planet getting infected and almost everyone on the planet having their lives disrupted by efforts to mitigate the virus. So on both the disease itself side and what we did in response, this was a much bigger earthquake than any of those diseases. And so everybody is invested in some way in who's responsible. And they're invested in a sort of on many different levels. But one of them is that if we can tell ourselves that there was a very clear path of responsibility, we can also tell ourselves that we might have avoided that and that we would have had we could have engineered a very different outcome. If this disease came out of, the Wuhan Institute, in part because they were not applying the same safety standards that we might want in the US, then we could say, well, let's restrict this kind of research. Let's impose these kinds of standards. There are things that we could do which would mean going forward that we might not face these risks again. And in retrospect, allow us to say everything that we went through, all the people getting sick and all the people dying, it's not just about human vulnerability to disease and the fact that even in the modern world, we are still hugely vulnerable as individuals across the world, across the age spectrum, but it is the fault of some small number of individual actors who we can pin the blame on. And I think, there are various, that question of responsibility, I think, we have to be careful about how we do it, but just at the psychological level, it is very appealing to be able to say, it is your fault. I suffered, it is your fault. And I think that's one of the main reasons why, I think I'm more open to the lab origin than you are. I think that, probably I would side on natural origin too, but I'm much more open to the possibility of a lab origin. I think it's something close to 50-50.
But on that, David, you have been critical of some of the mainstream science response to this issue. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I would just say, the first thing I would say is, to reiterate the point I made a minute ago, which is I think there's a lot of criticism to be made of scientists, science communicators, the media, and politicians on exactly how this was discussed. But fundamentally, I think we are invested in and interested in this idea at a more fundamental level. I think that we would still be talking in these terms whether or not there had been, quote unquote, a suppression campaign undertaken.
Is there a way to move forward by taking some things off the table? So there's two kinds of lab leak. It was an accident, and then there was a purposeful engineering of a virus. Those are very different. Is there any way, or is there anything to move the needle to take something like that off the table? Or is that still a distinct and real possibility from what you know?
My understanding is that most scientists are pretty dismissive of purposeful engineered bioweapon. Take it to zero. I think most people would say we don't know quite enough about the Chinese military part of the virological operation there to say for sure. Yeah. But I think most scientists would say it's not a big, serious possibility.
I would agree. And I would say, I was working on this from December 2019, and I remember discussions being open of where this could have originated. And as we were playing with the data that we had, it became more and more clear which one was more likely. And so over time, that's where I've been led. And I think that, one, it's very humbling that the public thinks that virologists can do that. We cannot. We do not know enough. And any virologist in the world could not have engineered something like this. And if they had, there would have been so many differences.
You mean there's no amount of gain of function that can do that? I can't gain of function on top of gain of function.
Oh, no. Nature's gain of function all the time. That's what it is every reiteration of the virus has the opportunity and to become something that is more pathogenic or more transmissible. Again, I think that if you're going to engineer something, the impact has to be there. And I think that that's where, not knowing Dr. Shi personally, but having been in the same sphere.
Who's Dr.
Xi Zhengli,
Yeah.
who is known as the Bat Woman because she was actually studying these coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yes, yeah. And I was studying bat viruses before they were cool. And now
She's wearing bat earrings today, for those of you who can't see.
And
Wow.
yes, but Dr. Shi is a global hero, and it's devastating to me that she doesn't. That's not how she's treated. She's treated like a criminal, and even though she opened up her lab and did everything that was asked, and had been working in this space for decades in order to help the public, like looking for these viruses is critical to understand what the risk to humans is. And I think that, at some point it was blaming the messenger. She found it, and we had that sequence in January of 2020. That is remarkable. That is faster than we have had the sequence for anything. And that action is why we had the vaccine in the time that we did, which saved at least 6 million Americans, 20 million worldwide. I mean, I don't know many actions in which that's like the outcome, but.
And what's the, but I mean,
I think that you said a few things that I think
Sorry, please.
I would put different perspective on. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you said that this could not be done by scientists. I mean, there was a proposal, the diffuse proposal, that was put together by a group of both American and Chinese scientists proposing to to engineer a virus that looks a lot like the one that we ultimately got. It was to take a bat coronavirus to add a furin cleavage site. That proposal was not funded by the NIH, but they were
When?
working together a blueprint. When was
is
that
this?
proposal?
Roughly.
2018, 2019.
Right.
In theory, these scientists were saying, like, let's take a virus like this and add some features like this. And that is something like the mix that we ultimately got.
Yeah.
I don't think that
No,
this
no,
is
no.
like a smoking gun about SARS-CoV-2, but I think it's a little misleading to say that scientists wouldn't know how to engineer a virus like this. They were proposing
They were
to engineer
trying.
a virus like
Right.
this. I think
they were proposing it in a funding document.
Yeah. So I guess what I would say is, not that we can't engineer viruses. I've made viruses glow green, red. Like, you can engineer them. You can do things. That's part of the scientific method. In order to understand how viral proteins work, you have to knock them out and see how that changes. And
So what is different in this case?
in
In SARS-CoV-2, you're saying this particular one could not have been engineered.
Sure. So there were so many parts of the sequences that were so surprising. And one, like with the knowledge we have in science, you'd be like, well, why would we do that? If I were the bad guy in this movie, there are a lot of things about it that would be done differently if it were intentionally created. And I think that we also in the US, as well as several other countries, signed a bioweapons accord. And so like we follow very stringent rules to that regard. And it's never about making a virus that is more infectious to people. But
I mean, those terms and exactly how they apply have been used in different ways at different times. But I would also say that as part of the FOIA material around this diffuse proposal, you had an exchange between Peter Daszak and Ralph Barrick, where in the metadata or whatever, in the comments on the proposal, they said, by the way, we don't want to put this in the proposal because it's going to freak people out, but we're going to have to do this in China, not in the US. And if we put that in the proposal, the American funders are going to be freaked out about that. So let's keep that out of the proposal. Now, again, I'm not saying that this proposal is a smoking gun. I think people who have pointed to it to make that case are overstating the case. I just mean to say something like this kind of research could have produced something like this virus. And I think that is one part of the picture. Another thing you said that I would push back on is that to describe Xi Jinping in her response as so open. I mean, she didn't open the database of viruses. She just reviewed it herself and told us what she found. I think that's really important. It's also really important that none of these people who are involved in this diffuse proposal in particular said in 2020, by the way, publicly, we were talking about something like this. We didn't do it. We want to tell you, like, we know that this is not something we did because we were talking about it and didn't undertake it. If you're in a moment where there's this giant global pandemic going on, and one of the threads of conversation is how did this happen? And people are talking about this particular set of scientists and their relationships. For a year and a half, there was this ongoing conversation. It reached peaks of intensity and then, cooled down, but there were a lot of peaks of pretty high intensity. And at no point during that period did any of those people think it was important to come forward and say, let me show you my hard drive, show you the proposals that I was working on. I want to explain this to you because I need to tell you that it shows that we didn't do this, and instead waited for it to come out via a FOIA request. I think that again, I'm not saying that this is proof of guilt.
there are things that are lost when you're having those communications. I think there's also differences for what countries do follow the bioweapons accord and who doesn't. Obviously,
but I think his point is this: there was a pandemic, and like there were all these people dying, and these people knew about this particular grant proposal. But let me say this one thing, David. Take us through, why is this still something that is continuing to burn? Why can't we just be satisfied with, we may never know?
I think that there are a lot of layers. So one layer is, it's just really uncomfortable to say we don't know. That is really uncomfortable for people. It's uncomfortable because of what we went through.
Particularly with COVID.
The second part of it is like, we are really angry and upset by what we went through, whether it was because of people who died or the disruption to individual lives, and we want to lay responsibility somewhere. It's especially appealing as Americans to think that that was done by a foreign adversary. That's like comforting to know that, although it's also the case that, you know, the team that is being pilloried here is like basically half American and half Chinese. But putting that aside, and then I think that there is a pattern throughout the pandemic of where many figures, leading figures in the public health establishment, you know, in the virological community, behaved badly, and we are part of what the pandemic did to us generally, putting aside the lab leak, was increased distrust, I think for the reasons I was talking about earlier, because we want to believe that it was possible to avoid the suffering, and we don't want to acknowledge that it was just natural that we suffered this way. But, you know, there are things to point to. If you're the kind of person who wants to blame someone, there are things to point to for bad behavior. So we mentioned the proximal origins paper. You know, I think my own view is that was in certain ways a defensible work of science.
Just take us through that. Like, what is the proximal origins paper?
It was a letter published in February of 2020, which basically said a bunch of prominent virologists, we looked at everything we can see about this virus now. We looked at various possible origins for it, and we think, you know, the clear bulk of the evidence lies on this being a virus of natural origin. And because of the people who were attached to it, you know, Fauci wasn't named as an author, but he was part of the group of people who helped put it together. It was done to some extent at his instigation. And the stature that they had in the scientific community and the access that they had to sort of, you know, public media and that kind of thing, it became the sort of like expression of scientific consensus about the origin of the virus. As I said earlier, a lot of the people who did that work had previously expressed, you know, questions about the origin, but they would say now we resolve them, and the paper is now the result of that process. But, you know, it was, I would say, an effort to tamp down conversation about other origins of the virus and say to the public, we basically know the story here. Stop asking those questions.
Interesting. So I see it very differently as a virologist, is that like, not to tamp down the public, but to reassure them that like, this is the most likely, not to, you know, they still continue to look at the research for lab leak or not. And ultimately all of those authors would still say, we may never know. And ultimately,
I think those are two versions of saying the same thing. I didn't mean to make it sound so conspiratorial. I think that certainly most, if not all of those authors feel like it expresses their views. I don't think that they think it's in bad faith, but it was nevertheless basically a say, like, let's not have this conversation now.
Well, I think that's interesting too, because, you know, we're in a pandemic, we're in a crisis, we have limited resources, and we need to spend them on this or that. And for me, that's where, and for a lot of scientists, I think that's where this continually to come up is frustrating, because people want to know what we can tangibly do to prevent the next pandemic, and better regulations on wet market, better surveillance of animal-human interfaces, having therapeutics and vaccines for pandemics.
But now everyone thinks the next pandemic is going to come from a lab.
Yes. And then that's where all the resources and the money is going to go. And there are tangible other things that we could be doing as a society to make sure that we never have to face a pandemic again. And no one wants to.
David, talk about the big elephant in the room, which is also polarization.
Yeah.
And how this all went down. I mean, if we built like word clouds, right? And we said lab leak, like Tom Cotton, Fox News, CIA. If we do natural origin, it's like Anthony Fauci. You know, you can build
Mainstream
this out.
science.
Mainstream
Maggie Bartlett.
science, Chinese media, like it's these. We can start to sort of see the chasm that this debate fell into in this country. I know it's not the whole thing, but like just speak a little bit about how this all went down vis-a-vis polarization.
Well, I think there's actually a pretty big difference between the way it played out sort of on the public stage and the way that it played out in the American public writ large, which is to say, you watch TV, you read newspapers, you watch Senate hearings, you listen to politicians. You'd have a sense that things were really, really deeply polarized along partisan lines. I think it's actually a bit more nuanced when you look at public opinion. And I think that's true of the pandemic as a whole. We actually look back on the first year of the pandemic and assume that everyone in red states was going out and partying and everyone in blue states was bunkered in their apartments. And actually compliance was basically even state to state all the way through the vaccination period, which is, that's a whole other subject we could have a whole other podcast about. But I think there's something similar going on with the lab leak story, which is to say, yes, at a public level, our avatars were organized into two teams.
Yeah.
And in particularly because of the way that Donald Trump operated in that space, he, negatively polarized Democrats very much in the opposite direction. So that, it was a conventional liberal view in mid 2020, late 2020, that not only was the disease likely a natural origin, but that saying otherwise was a kind of quasi-racist conspiracy theory.
And at the time, I remember it was actually, there was some anti-Asian sentiment in this country.
Well, especially very early on. Yeah.
Yeah,
especially.
very early on.
And
So it's really interesting, David, that you say that, because I do think it came about at a time when you had, I think, Bill de Blasio and Nancy Pelosi going to Chinatown to kind of show their support. And at the same time, so suddenly it became, you're a Democrat if you believe in wet market, and you're a Republican if you believe in lab leak.
Although the polling numbers are different, though. I mean, I know there was a signal being pumped out by each team, right? But
you're saying how Americans actually thought.
More Americans than straight blue-red were thinking, this doesn't seem right. This is lab leak. And I wonder if it's social media, the way that this story sort of moved through social media, and people were spending 6 minutes analyzing and forming an opinion about which theory is right. The lab leak theory just landed to them as a more attractive answer. And I really like what you said about it's easier to say they did it. We've got it. Because the alternative is we did it, which is climate change, deforestation. We're interacting
even
with
putting aside the responsibility, just we are vulnerable.
Yeah, we're vulnerable.
Yeah.
In the 21st century, in a rich country like America, walking down concrete streets, and we are nevertheless still living in the world of microbes and viruses, and may die en masse as a result. That is a really uncomfortable thing for a modern
Right,
American
as versus this intriguing story of something, you're angry, something's being hidden, there's leaked emails, things are being FOIA,
they did try to explain so much that they did analysis, and we can't get into it, 96% similar, and how that is so lost. It's so hard to communicate that. But you said a couple things, look, that the story hasn't changed in 5 years. And now that we have just become so polarized, and science and politics are maybe even the same thing these days, is there some benefit for the political side and for, honestly, not in the best way? Is there some benefit that this is never going to be answered? And are we weaponizing the uncertainty? Just look at the politics of the world we're in now. I think are there some people that are more than happy that we don't have an answer, and just that it further creates political storm?
Well, I would say personally, I think it's good that we're looking at the safety of lab research. I think that probably we're not operating as carefully in some of this territory as we should, and it's good to be.
Have you been in high containment?
No.
We should go. We'll go to a BSL-4.
But there's a lot of risky stuff that's being done in BSL-3s and BSL-2s all around the world. Not as much in the U.S., but often funded by American money.
Those are different levels of security and precautions in labs.
Yeah, biosafety levels go by tiers, and basically most of them start at 2 right now, but they're leveled that way for protections for the scientists and for the public. And we have Like I've stuck myself with a needle, and then you go through a reporting system, and
Jeez, Maggie, why are you sticking yourself with
everybody
needles?
it happens. It
Okay.
is
Take care of
terrifying.
yourself.
I'm fine.
Right.
But it's one of those things where we do have those sort of reporting requirements here. And what concerns me is that that's
But they're
not true
not
for every country.
And they're also not always honored. I mean, Alison Young's book, Pandora's Gamble, is like dozens of examples of accidents that were not properly reported.
But
But
you know,
if we make it so that people are scared to report, they're going to be less likely to. And so there has to be a balance, right? Of like, what is the science that we need to do to help the public and move things forward, and also have the safeguards in place to make sure that if things happen, people are protected. Because
and finish your thought, because I think it is interesting from the science community. It appears that there is this fear that now important research is going to be curtailed.
It depends which scientists you talk to. I mean, there's also a very prominent group of scientists who think gain of function research is not useful. That maybe the risks aren't as large as, someone who's sure that COVID came out of a lab thinks they are. But they're like, point me to the example of a pandemic that was blunted or, eliminated because we had anticipated the evolution of the virus ahead of time. They're like, Mark Lipsitch at Harvard, is probably the most prominent figure here. Very serious, very credentialed person who's like, maybe there's some small number of instances where this kind of research is worthwhile, but I think we need to be asking much, much harder questions about the payoff before we allow things that could potentially be risky to go forward. And, this is a little bit above my pay grade, but that doesn't seem to me like a crazy perspective. When I think about the sort of overreaction, overreach, weaponizing of science world that we're living in, I actually find the where we've landed on lab research to be relatively comfortable. The thing that really worries me is that we've essentially abandoned any pretense towards public health, which is part of a different conversation. But that is much more concerning to me than the fact that we're going to be putting much higher standards, much more rigorous scrutiny on gain of function research, is the fact that like half of American states now have laws against mask wearing. And you're just like
that,
David,
or that
vaccine exemptions are like skyrocketing.
That's
you're okay with the guardrails.
Fascinated by. I liked your H5N1 piece, and that's something that scares me now is like we've got all the same ingredients that were occurring in China at the time where we have a potentially pandemic virus and an animal host close to humans, and now we're in this weird time where public health has been really pulled back in the US. And like, how do we address that now and get to solutions?
One of the things that really worries me is that a lot of the people who are coming in the Trump administration just don't seem to me to have our best interests here at heart. Like they are people who have overstated the failures of the previous regime, so to speak, and are now essentially interested in burning it all down. And I think that there are reasonable critiques to make of the way that all of that was handled, under the last administration. We were just talking a few minutes ago. We mentioned the Proximal Origins paper. I think while I admire Anthony Fauci and basically think that he was an admirable actor throughout the pandemic, I do think on a few occasions he answered public questions incorrectly, was not forthcoming in the way that he might have. I think there are some failures there. I think when we talk about, the CIA, the new CIA, analysis, which was just publicized, that is also the response of kind of bad behavior, whereby, the Republican Congress mandated a report from the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, bringing together intel from all the intel agencies. A whistleblower has alleged that she paid off CIA analysts to change their assessment from what we now see as their official assessment, that is low probability lab leak to low confidence lab leak to low confidence natural origin. That hasn't exactly been solidified, but like that, a whistleblower has alleged that. It has been publicized by the Republican subcommittee. And then when the report was actually released, it was an incredibly short report full of redactions. It was meant to be, everything has to be shared with the public. And in fact, we got like a one-page memo.
Right. It was
there was like nothing in it. Like basically they had
Not
defied
satisfying.
the law and not shared the information that was required by law. And now what we're seeing with the new CIA announcement is basically like, okay, we're going to tell you what we really thought a year ago before the director of national intelligence got involved in muddying the communication. All of that I think is quite bad behavior. And I think it's reasonable for someone looking at that to say, that's really not how we should be acting. We should be trusting the public with the information that we have. And, you know, especially 3, 4, or 5 years out of the pandemic, understand that they can maybe process some things like low probability assessments without thinking it's going to alarm them or change their basic view of ultimate responsibility for the pandemic.
David, so one of the things that Trump did early in 2020 was downplay the virus a lot. And it's surprising to me that Tony gets a lot of the flack. Ultimately, the commander-in-chief is who's responsible for the American people. And like, if we were to face another pandemic again, I think, you know, Trump didn't want people to panic. He had said that before. Like, that's part of why he
Fauci said that too. And
Right.
in February 2020, he was saying the risk is minuscule.
Right. So people need to trust the American public, regardless of what administration. At this point, I'm worried about the next pandemic and how do we get leadership to empower people with that truth. And
I'm scared. I mean, you mentioned the H5N1. You know, my sense of things is that, you know, we're not like on the brink of a total catastrophe there. That the human cases that we've seen have been, I think, relatively mild. There have been, you know, 1 or 2 deaths and a few hospitalizations. But, you know, given
a lot
what
of
we
cats have died, though.
Oh, I mean,
Sorry.
I mean, hundreds of millions of birds. And
Yes.
I mean,
eggs.
I didn't mean to make a joke. Yeah. All of these.
Yeah. But, you know, it's given what we were expecting ahead of time, like the fatality rate seems to be lower for the moment. But I think we are so completely unprepared at every level of public health to take command of this threat. We are not, we're literally not even testing the dairy cows that are infected. We're not communicating. We're not manufacturing the vaccines and the antivirals that we actually have.
Yes.
We're not even making them available to people. We're not vaccinating birds. We're just doing none of the things.
Or cattle.
Wow, you're a barrel of laughs, David.
But here's what I would say is we experienced a pandemic. It was horrible for everyone. Everyone has their own experience during that. We never have to face one again. And in order to get us to that place, I think, one, accountability is nice, but actions are going to speak louder. And so if I had to say something to the administration that's in charge right now, it's we need a similar thing to Space Force for pathogens. So we need a pandemic response that is robust and ready and doing things like surveillance of these pathogens in animals before they're ever in people. Because waiting for human to human transmission is a dark way, because you're basically saying we need a certain number of deaths before we act. It's already too late.
And I think that in a really big picture level, like the big one question for me is like, okay, so let's posit and assume for a second that this was a lab leak. Let's then play out what would have happened if not only that were true, but we had known it essentially for real right from the start. What would the response have been? How would it have been different? Where would we be 5 years later? Would we be in a better place? Would we be in a worse place? My own view is that people would have been more scared in 2020 than they were, because they would have associated it with the bioengineering risk. Even if it wasn't what had happened, they would have thought of it in those terms. Probably we would have had a more intense kind of lockdown period. But we probably would have produced just as intense a backlash coming out of it, because the result would have been the same, which is that given the fatality rates, we basically had, the whole country locking down to protect a small percentage of the public. And I'm for that protection. I think it's worth it to save those lives. But I think the basic logic of the backlash is that most people don't feel that way, or some large minority of the public doesn't feel that way, that they think, 1.5 million Americans died, so be it. The real problem is that my kids' schools were closed and I had to wear a mask for a year. Right. And I think that that's really ugly morally. And I think when we retell the history of the pandemic, we need to put the death and illness and hospitalization first, always. But I'm not sure that the ultimate aftermath would have been all that different in the domestic public health space. What I do think is that the geopolitics would have been very, very different. And there, I'm not sure that they would have been better. I think we might be in a much worse place with China if the world had decided, oh my
God, I'm nervous. We would have declared war or something.
I think we would know.
I think we would have treated it like a terrorist attack.
Final thought, because I know you have to go. It's not hyperbole to say that the way that this went down, this story that we've been telling ourselves about the origin of this virus, in some ways has accelerated us into a place where public health is going out the window, right? I mean, people, if 2/3 of Americans think that public health played a role in creating this pandemic, it has accelerated us to a place where we don't want public health anymore. We want sort of everybody for themselves.
I think that is the core pitch of MAHA, and it is the core idea of the Trump public health apparatus is, you can manage your own risk. I mean, on some level, this is also what Biden messaged on COVID. Like, especially post-vaccines, the message was like, you navigate your risk landscape on your own. We're not going to even really ask you to mask anymore. We're not going to be doing testing. Like, normality is more important than the additional protection that those measures would offer. That was basically the Biden approach. And Trump is taking that a few steps further, not just on the question of COVID, which I think has receded as a threat, basically reasonably for most people. What we're going to do is build a kind of approach to the country's health that is about individual action, individual assessment of risk, individual behavioral change. And while I think all of those things contribute and maybe even should be emphasized more than they have been in the past, it's also really important to know that, like, it's called public health for a reason. These risks are collective. One of the things that happened throughout this whole pandemic was that we were all playing a game of chance. We may have thought we were fit and didn't have any respiratory illness, but like those things only kind of like for a given age range doubled your risk of dying from COVID. Whereas getting 15 years older increased your risk by 10 or 15 times. It's like we told ourselves that the things that shaped our vulnerability were in our control when mostly they were out of our control. And that set of ideas is really uncomfortable for all of us. We've responded to this pandemic experience essentially by deluding ourselves into thinking that we can control our own health fates going forward, and then we don't have to pay attention to our obligations to one another, to the community as a whole. And I think that's really, really dangerous. I think it's appealing. I understand its appeal, but I also think it's really bad.
Well said, David. Listen, thank you so much for joining us. That was a spirited discussion, y'all. I knew we said we weren't going to litigate lab leak versus wet market. There was a little bit of...
We could get more. We could have talked more about lineage A, lineage B in those papers. I have some thoughts about that.
Don't tease me with fear and cleavage sites. Listen, David, thank you so much. You are always so fun to talk with. I hope you come back on this podcast. And we are very shortly going to turn to Dr. Robert Garry, who for the past 4 decades, he's worked as a professor at Tulane University. His studies, he studies emerging viruses from HIV to Ebola to the first SARS virus before turning his attention to SARS-CoV-2. Now, David talked a little bit about this proximal origins paper, and we are speaking with one of the people who was one of the authors of the proximal origin paper. And while he is not ruling out the possibility of a lab leak, this group of people, of which Dr. Garry is one of the members, he has concluded that the most likely explanation is that COVID evolved naturally. And since that paper, he's even more convinced that the virus has emerged from the Wuhan wet market. Dr. Robert Garry, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
As we stated earlier, this is the issue that won't go away. And now it is front and center from, you've got the CIA assessment, you've got the pardoning of Dr. Fauci, you've got potential subpoenas to various federal agencies that fund research, and potentially the halting of some of what's considered risky research. And my first question to you as a virologist is, what's your reaction to this? When you wake up and you read all this news, what goes through your mind?
Well, it is a little amazing to me that, a little 3,000-word opinion piece that we wrote 5 years ago continues to attract so much attention. Obviously, the origin of a major pandemic like the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be on people's minds. It's an important issue to consider. But I didn't expect to have all of the sort of direct challenges and some of the other issues that have arisen just because we simply wrote a paper for the scientific literature.
What do you think? Why do you think people are so resistant? And I know you testified that 5 years or several years later, you believe in even more that it was natural origin. Nothing's taken you off of that original assessment. It's only, furthered you down that line of thinking. Why do you think so many Americans don't believe that's what happened? That so many Americans, I think it's 2/3 we said at the top of the podcast, would go with the lab leak as an explanation for this.
I mean, I think it's kind of a human thing. You want to maybe have somebody that you can blame for it. And it's a simpler story too. I mean, the natural origin, you have to, believe in the virus is evolving into a pathogenic form. And that's a little bit difficult concept for people to understand. It's much easier to think about, because people, or watch movies and read comic books and things like that, a scientist put together the virus in a lab and that somehow escaped, or maybe they released it on purpose. That it's just a simpler story that people sort of become attuned to than, the sort of the ongoing natural process where, things like viruses, which don't do anything except replicate and change, can evolve into pathogens that can cause, these devastating events like a pandemic.
Bob, I said to one of our other guests that this virus, SARS-CoV-2, really couldn't have been created in a lab. And there were a lot of reasons why I thought that. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, just as a virologist perspective, as what we know about viruses, what we know now about SARS-CoV-2 versus what we didn't know in 2020.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the point. I mean, we know a lot about viruses, but no virologist, not even, the best group of virologists on the planet, could have figured out how to turn a bat virus like the progenitor of SARS-CoV-2 into one that would, cause a pandemic and spread as easily and, cause just the right amount of, infection in just the right groups of people that, could lead to deaths in some and, just spread easily in others. We don't know enough about viruses. We don't have that much knowledge to be able to actually sit down and design it, or even to take a virus that, might be close, like a virus in a bat, for example, and modify it, do all the changes that would be necessary to make that virus become one that has all the sort of almost magical, mystical properties of a virus like SARS-CoV-2, which turned out to be a pandemic. These things these things evolve by chance in nature. The viruses are spreading in various animals, from one animal to another. They pick up different properties, and sometimes they pick up just the right, set of substitutions, mutations that allow the virus to take off when they find their way into the right population in people. It's a random thing. Nobody in the lab could reproduce that, or figure out how to do it. There's just, not enough scientists compared to the vast numbers of, viruses out there in nature that are constantly spreading from one species to another and testing these things out, millions, billions of times over than what any scientist anywhere or group of scientists could do in a lab.
Yeah. Dr. Garry, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's a skeptic of the wet market theory for a second. Can you understand why somebody might be mistrustful of the natural origins explanation? And zooming out even further from that, I mean, we're at a point where it's so much bigger than lab leak versus wet market. It's really about a suspicion over what, what's being considered dangerous or funding of dangerous research, and the idea that President Obama halted a certain kind of funding for research, for this gain of function research once upon a time, and then it was kind of restarted through a third channel. Like, there's just, it's this suspicion is building amongst a lot of folks. And if you were just going to respond to that, A, can you understand some of the mistrust? And B, what do you say to it?
Well, the science is hard. We're talking about, complex epidemiology. We're talking about phylogenetics, studying the family trees of viruses. I mean, there are clearly some of the papers that we published, like in Science and, Cell and other places that are, pretty complex pieces of in-depth science. I mean, you have to understand, how to interpret what I just said was a phylogenetic tree. That's hard. I mean, I'm not the leading expert in that, and people have to remind me about different things that, what such an analysis can do and can't do. And I'm sympathetic to people that, read some of our papers and just kind of glaze over at the thought that, oh, well, this proves it's a natural origin, because, the science is tough. But I would also like to point out that there's some motivated thinking too. Why people are distrustful of the natural origin. I said this earlier. People, want to have a villain. They want to, be able to blame somebody. And the virus did arise in China. There are a lot of people that are mistrustful of the Chinese government. There's probably very good reasons for that. They haven't been forthcoming and sharing all the early data and all the information that they had. Some of that's understandable. Some of it's I would put more in the category of unfortunate, but that creates mistrust, and so we don't have all the information, but in my view, we have enough science, enough data to really stand and say, look, this virus much more likely to have arisen as a natural virus like the first SARS did, and like virtually all, not all, but most other epidemics or pandemics have arisen, that is spread from an animal to a human.
You talked about, people needing and wanting a villain to blame. You've been at this for 4 decades? Chasing down,
maybe even a little going on to the 5th one here.
Chasing down Ebola, other viruses, trying to figure out the origins. You go to Capitol Hill. In some ways, you are treated as a villain. What was that like for you?
Well, it wasn't exactly what I expected. Like I said, a lot of, attention devoted to, the paper that we wrote, The Proxy Origin of SARS-CoV-2. And, people are looking for people to, put a little blame on. So I believe that it's important to do good science communication. I mean, sometimes that puts you in the crosshairs, apparently, of people who are, don't have the best interests of science, and I would say the best interests of our population, people in the U.S. and worldwide in mind. They have, political agendas and things like that. And so it's unfortunate.
Was it hard? Like, was the science for you like an armor? Like, you can yell at me all you want, but this is the science that's in front of me. This is the truth. This is where scientific method has taken me. This is what I'm going to say. You can scream all you want. Or did you take it personally? Was it upsetting to you? Like, what were your emotions?
Well, scientists are human beings too. So I can't say that it was
we are.
totally. Yeah, we really are. Yes. And, so I can't say that it was, an entirely pleasant experience to be, to be screamed at and yelled at, by Congress people. But, as you said, I mean, I am confident in the science and the science that we produce. It's been all peer reviewed. It's been published in the best scientific journals in the world. So, I do have that to kind of fall back on. And, plus the fact that as you said, I've been doing this for quite a number of decades. I know pretty much the field as well as anybody, I would say. I've got a lot of experience in the field. And so I'm confident, if I say something, I'm probably going to have a good basis for it. And, people are probably not going to be able to shake me out of that belief very easily, at least, it's certainly not by yelling at me.
I think when you've been doing the work you've been doing for so long, it's natural to feel confident. At the same time, this was like nothing we've ever seen before. I mean, we were asking questions like, is this the most powerful virus the land has seen? All of these amazing, like superlative type of questions. And you are, were put in a spot to, lead that charge or write that paper. And 2 questions on that. You're about to hit send and submit that paper. How do you feel at that moment? I want you to go back to that moment if you can and tell me what kind of pressure that was and how confident you were, without getting too much into the science, more about just what you were feeling. And then the second thing is you said it's peer reviewed and it stands the test of time. Is there anything you would do differently, or a do-over, or phrase slightly differently?
I think you have to realize that when we wrote the paper, the proximal origin paper, it was pretty early in the pandemic. I mean, and certainly when we started to write it, there was really no indication, that this was necessarily going to turn into the, ordeal that the whole human race has been put through over the past 5 years. So I'd say the pressure was not that high. I mean, we've written a lot of, it's a 3,000 word article, right? So, we spent, the four of the authors and then the fifth author, which we brought on, spent, 6, maybe 8 weeks on writing and polishing up the paper. It was a pretty intense effort. I mean, you can see part of that effort, all of our private communications have been subpoenaed and made public, with all the, banter that, very often accompanies a process like this. But we, I think did a good job. I mean, and I've said this, you quoted me there, that, the paper stood up. It stood, there are most of the things in the paper have, been either come true or, we qualified them enough that we knew they might not come true. I mean, we did make the prediction that we'd find a bat virus with a furin cleavage site or one that was close to it. Well, some bat viruses have been found that have, partial furin cleavage sites, not the whole thing yet. And maybe we can come back and talk about that. But I would say even most of the predictions in that article came true. Would we have done anything different? I can't really think of anything. Honestly, it may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think we did a pretty good job.
I think one of the criticisms of that paper, and I'm curious of what you say, is that at the time it came out, it was expressing a certainty that many feel was premature. Do you think expressing some uncertainty maybe would have helped, keep some of these criticisms at bay?
Well, if you go back and read it, we did express uncertainty. We said that we didn't think that a laboratory origin was plausible. I would even go further today. I would say it's, there's no evidence for it. It didn't happen that way, various other things. So we said it wasn't plausible, but we didn't say it was impossible. We said that additional evidence could sway our minds about it. I think we put in all the other caveats. And in fact, one of the possible pathways that we discussed in the paper was basically a lab origin, cell culture passage. So, that didn't happen. But I think we were sufficiently cautious. Some of the reviews that we got wanted us to go even further. And I think that's also been documented in some of the, the messages and back and forth. And they wanted us to make it even more definitive, and we weren't willing to go that far. It's like other things in science, you put your views out there, you try to express them with the best, the best knowledge that you have at the time that you're submitting it, and then it goes from there.
It's sort of a theme, and I say this with Bob listening. There's a lot of scientists who feel I do the work, I follow the leads, I follow the data, I publish it, I put it out to peers, it's reviewed, I move on to the next question.
Mm-hmm.
But in this one, it didn't go down with the public the way it has in the past, right? The dog wasn't liking the dog food. Like it didn't work that way.
And in some ways, I think that's a spot on assessment, Tom, because in some ways, Dr. Garry, I feel like you guys as scientists, what I'm hearing you say is you were doing what you always do.
Yeah.
But one assessment of the story is that you walked into a 2020 media environment that was really different. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure that all you guys were prepared for what that looked like. And in some ways, as a journalist, I would say everybody should be wide-eyed about the world we're living in right now. But the truth is, when you... look, I think it appears from our previous guest, David Wallace-Wells, that, there are still folks, reasonable folks within science, folks within other disciplines who aren't 100% sure about the origins of this. And I would like to think as a society, we can still have reasonable debates and conversations. Right. But that is not what's happening in this country.
And it was also a society that was walking into 2020 that had gone through many years, if not decades, of a brewing anger and mistrust of establishment, of
Correct.
institutions.
You mean before 2020?
Before 2020, of expertise. You had years of this building from,
what kind of things?
From the financial crisis.
Opioid epidemic and big pharma's role in it.
Right.
The bailout of the banks, foreign wars, the moving of industry overseas and the loss of jobs. There was just a lot of tectonic changes. And I think people came into 2020, with trust in institutions and expertise, like this gentleman here. They weren't buying it.
Yeah.
So how, Bob, you've been at the forefront for emerging infectious diseases for a while. How has the response to your expertise been from the media side of things different during this pandemic from, looking at Ebola, SARS-1, and other threats?
I think journalists learn pretty quickly, when they're talking to people, whether, the information they're being given is correct and holds up, or whether it, is maybe off the top of their head, maybe not so good. So, they maybe not come back to the person again. And, the fact that there have been journalists that have come back to me, over the years, I think, at least says I'm trying to do a good job with the communication. Nobody's perfect. Nobody makes 100% the right calls and everything like that. But
go ahead, Mark.
No, we're living in a world where 2/3 of the Americans or the population isn't really buying your message about, the natural origin being favored over the lab leak. What does science need to do differently? What do your colleagues feel needs to be changed or modified so that when you do put something out, you have bigger buy-in?
Well, scientists have just a few tools to communicate. They can, talk like this in the new media, or they can talk to reporters in the old media. And then the thing that I think that we're sort of most comfortable with and most obliged to do is to publish papers in the peer-reviewed scientific literature and let other scientists take a look at the work we've done, sort of give it that implied, stamp of approval, and then publish the papers in the best journals that we can. And that's kind of what we've been doing. Now, is it frustrating to me and perhaps others that share my views on the zoonotic origin of the virus, that more, people that are, lay people in the communities that, don't buy into it? Maybe a little bit, but, like I said, I've expressed my, it's harder, to try to understand, the natural evolution of viruses in nature than it is to think about, scientists in a lab constructing a virus and putting it together and maybe releasing it either by accident or on purpose. It's just an easier sell. It's a simpler concept. And so I'm not surprised that, that's the way it's come out, but, what can we do to change that? I think we can, continue to communicate, continue to look at the evidence and publish papers and, talk things. I can't say I'm the best person to do that, in the new media. I'm, getting
I think you're doing a great job, Bob. This is exactly,
Dr. Garry, let me jump in, because here's what I'll say, and I've heard this from several really distinguished scientists such as yourself, and it breaks my heart sometimes to hear from you guys, because you're like, look, I'm doing my job. You know, I am a scientist. I'm a researcher. I'm not some like glitzy communicator. That is no knock on you. You're as glitzy as they come. But I'm just saying that I've heard that from folks, you know. But what I just want to say, and this is my little soapbox moment as a journalist, as a media person, you know, it's no surprise to me that 70% of this country believes that, because that narrative has been really pushed out there. And the people who believe that have been saying it loudly, clearly, with emotion. Some of that may be misinformation. Some of that may be bad faith actors, but it's not all of that. And so I would just say that if you're a scientist who believes in the wet market theory, y'all are really quiet right now.
Well,
and I will just say, but I'm just saying,
I know.
That's not good enough. Like, if you guys want this viewpoint to be out there, you have to fight for it. You can't just say, I'm in my lab. And I know that's tough to hear, but like, I'll just say that this is a moment to engage. And I think that, you know, in 2025, in this new era of public health and science, I hope that people are realizing the responsibility they have to fight for their work and not just do the work. And I know that's a tough thing to hear, Dr. Garry.
Yeah, I mean, I've been making some of the same arguments to some of my colleagues too, that they maybe need to get out there a little bit more. I mean, we have other good communicators that can do this. You know, I think there's a role for the scientific societies too. I mean, American Society for Microbiology and Virology have done things. There is a very loud and very well organized and probably well funded group of people on the other side that have their own particular reasons for wanting to push the lab origin and blame scientists either in China or in the U.S. for making this virus and releasing it on the world. It's
It just will make it that much harder when the next pandemic comes around for people to believe people like you, which again breaks my heart considering the amazing work you've done. So that's the only kind of thing. And I know that Tom
the next pandemic may well be coming at us. I mean, I know you've heard about the bird flu.
It's also just
let's hope that doesn't go the way it possibly could, but we're basically seeing that virus evolving in real time, which is not
like
always
slow
the
motion
case.
Train wreck.
And so, it could be, but, I would point out that there are, a number of people already gearing up and, making the case, hey, this came from a lab somewhere, which is basically absurd.
Last question. Do you have faith in the end of the day that good, solid science will prevail? That we're sort of in a social media moment, we're in a partisan moment. A lot of this is getting looked through the lens of polarization. But in the end of the day, we will come back to sound scientific method as the answer, as our source of truth? Or are you pessimistic that we're moving away from that and many years from now, we may be spiraling out and looking for different sources of truth?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic in some of the points that you've made about, we should be fighting, a little bit harder and things like that. And we often, I think, amongst ourselves say, hey, look, you're not playing a short-term game where, where you get, a temporary, say, boost on the internet or something like that. We're playing the long game of good hard science. We're publishing the papers, doing the analyses, being careful about the analyses, trying to follow a scientific method. And in the long run, I am very confident that, people, will understand that, that we were doing our jobs and doing them right and had come to the right conclusion.
Dr. Garry, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you do. And I really appreciate you joining us on Why Should I Trust You? That was Robert Garry. Before that, David Wallace-Wells joined us. That was a pretty good, juicy conversation today, guys.
Yeah, complex issue.
I know.
I mean, a lot of science talk is a lot of science talk, and at some point, it needs to translate, especially in this new world that we're in, into policy. And the hearing that we just went through, and many that will probably come ahead, is going to be informed by a lot of this science talk, and how that translates into like the real world and into fundings and labs and research and publications. A lot ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mark. It seems to me that, the power of persuasion is really important these days. And I know we talk a lot about misinformation and bad faith actors and, folks who just troll the internet for, a moment to pounce. But at the same time, I find myself constantly having to, really think about why I trust somebody, why I believe in something, and why, if I do trust and believe in it, I can't just say, oh, because this person told me so, because they have a PhD and they've studied it their whole life. I need to really know why I believe that. And so again, I just go back to things don't just speak for themselves. They have to be earned. That trust has to be earned. It has to be presented as a case.
But what you're hearing from a lot of these scientists is saying this is what is tried and true. This methodology. I'm not going to let the world shake me and shake what I know to be true, what I know to be the proper way to do a study. We're not going to rewrite the entire scientific method and revisit some of the principles of science that, you have to have a question. We're still asking the question. You have to be able to replicate the research. We still want to be able to prove that we've replicated the research. And what we're hearing from a scientist is saying, look, like I have to stick to the rules that we have established and we know work. Now, you may be coming at me and saying, I don't like your science. I want a different method. But nothing has been proven to get us, a new answer. Like are we completely willing to throw out everything we know about science? I mean, he's telling us that I'm going to put my head down and still do real scientific work.
But even defending the scientific method and talking about it and cheerleading for it, I think is great. I want to hear that in the public arena. And I
think they're tired. I think they're tired
also,
of that.
I get it.
They got a job. Like a lot of the world that is the other side of this issue, their job is media. His job is, I work in a lab. But now we're saying to him, on top of working in a lab, you got to go on podcasts, go online, go on television.
Well, if it's not him, it's got to be somebody cheerleading.
I'm sitting right here, guys. And
You're doing both.
You're like, what am I, chap liver? No, I'm going to end it there. Thank you all so much. It was a great conversation. Thank you to Bob Garry. Thank you to David Wallace-Wells. Thank you to all the guests here, Mark, Tom, Maggie. And we will see you guys next week.